What's up everybody, this is Zoya, the Russian Korean. And I realized that I haven't done a vlog in a while, so I thought today would be actually a good time for me to kind of catch up on my vlog videos and talk about, some things that are not necessarily related to League, but just, my personal things. So I made a video a little bit of a while ago, but it was about kind of a tiny bit about my experience as a Korean in Russia. And a lot of you guys actually took interest in and you commented and were wondering what it was like for me to grow up there and do I have anything to say about, cultural differences and all that. And I mean, it's a lot to unpack. And so today I thought instead of trying to cram it all in together, I thought I would try to maybe make a series of different vlogs talking about these things. And so, yeah, guys, if you're interested, please let me know if you want more content like this and what kind of questions you have, just let me know in the comments. And, that would be really helpful for me. But today I thought it would be fitting for me to talk about just growing up in Russia as a Korean, as an Asian, and I guess what it was like. And yeah, one thing I want to say before I get into, my story is that I know that there are so many people out there who are just like me, but they may have had a different experience from mine. So please don't take my experience as the overarching experience for everybody. There are lots of Russian Koreans and everyone is an individual, everyone has different experiences, and I am just sharing my story and I guess what it was like for me and what kind of conclusions I'm making from it. So I am by no means trying to say that, oh, my experience is representative of everybody's experience. I think that's very misleading and it's just plain old false. Okay, so that disclaimer out of the way, let's get into the story. So I know there is a little bit of a confusion about how and why I'm a Russian Korean. So I hope that this video is gonna kind of make sense. So let's start with, where I was born. I was not born in Korea, okay? I'll make that clear. I was not born in Korea. I was born in Russia on an island called Sakhalin. And there I spent maybe the first 5 years of my life, and then my family moved to Moscow. So I would say that even though I was born in Sakhalin, and that's technically my hometown, most of my growing up, most of my formative years were in Moscow. But before I get into my experience in Moscow, I want to say that I am a third generation Russian Korean. So what does that mean? I think people get confused about what's first, what's second, what's third generation. Third generation basically means that I am a grandchild of the first immigrant. So my grandparents were born in Korea, but they came to Russia and gave birth to my parents in Russia. And then my parents in Russia gave birth to me. So that's how it works. There is also a generation called 1.5 generation, which is like, imagine your first generation, right? And they have children who were born in their home country, in their native country, and then they moved. So there is the first generation of parents, and then their children who were born abroad are now immigrating with them. They are called the 1.5 generation. So my parents were not 1.5 generation. They were the second generation, which means they were born already in the new land, not where my grandparents came from. And so all technicalities taken into account, I am a third generation Russian Korean. On the island of Sakhalin, there are plenty of families and people just like my family and me. But like I said a little bit earlier, I did not really grow up in Sakhalin. I grew up in Moscow. And Moscow is quite different. Like when I was in Sakhalin, I went to kindergarten for, I'm not sure how long, maybe like a year or half a year. And like there, I would say 40 or 50% of the kids that were in my class were also some sort of Asian. So it was not really like a big deal, I guess, that I was not Russian. But when I moved to Moscow and went to kindergarten there, I was literally, I believe, the only Asian there. And that would pretty much be a pattern. When I was in Moscow, I went to kindergarten, then all of elementary school and all of middle school I spent in Moscow. And yeah, it would be pretty much the same dynamic no matter where I went. So in my elementary school, I was the only Asian in my class. And by class, I mean like my homeroom. So I believe also in the entire first grade, I was like the only Asian. Actually, no, correction. There were some other kids of other minorities in my grade, but none of them were Far Eastern Asians. So in that sense, I was the only one. And that's like, I don't know, maybe out of 50 people. Overall, in my elementary school, there were some other Asians there, Far Eastern Asians. I will stick with this term, Far Eastern Asian, okay? So I'm not just going to talk about Korean, but, you know, just people who kind of look like me. And yeah, there were other people there, but not a lot of us, just like, I could count everybody just on one hand. Like, I don't even need both of my hands. And when I got to middle school, my brother and I, we went to the same middle school, and I think we were the only Far Eastern Asians in the entire school, which included middle school and high school. I also went to music school. There were some Asians there, but not too many. So, I mean, you get the picture, right? And I mean, it makes sense because Russia doesn't have the kind of history that, you know, let's say the United States has, or Australia or Canada, which kind of has immigration at its heart. I mean, Russia is unique in the sense that it is really wide, right? So it has a European part, and then this awkward middle part, and then the eastern part. So but it's all one country. And so depending on where you are in the country, you're going to have different people, different experiences, different demographics. So once again, it's pretty hard for, you know, someone like me to come out and say, oh, my experience is the same as everyone else's, because depending on where you are just geographically in Russia, your experience is going to be different. But yeah, growing up in Moscow, that was what I had, which was I was very clearly and very apparently a very small, tiny minority. Now, what did it mean for my social life and interaction with other people? Everything was great. Seriously though, I have very little to complain about. Honestly, like looking back, I had lots of friends throughout elementary school, throughout middle school. I made some friends that like I'm still in touch with today. There were some friends that I lost touch with, but when I was in elementary and middle, I had plenty of people to talk to hang out with, to go to birthday parties with. Like, you know, I just had like a normal childhood. Of course, you always have, as a kid, people who like you, don't like you. I mean, it's true for adults too, let's be real. But overall, I had lots of friends, and plenty of them were really good friends, pretty close friends. I never felt like my friends were judging me or treating me differently because I was just physically different from them. Yeah, I never really experienced any kind of judgment from them. They were curious about like my culture, what kind of food I eat at home. And, you know, sometimes there were times when like I would have something for lunch and I would bring it to school and it clearly looks very different from Russian food. And, you know, they wouldn't be like, ew, what are you eating? It was never like that. They would be like, wow, can I try? Like, is this good? What is this? And like, in that sense, you know, being unique was actually kind of good for me because it made me feel like, you know, I was a little more unique, which I think is important for a kid, you know, to feel special. And the fact that my friends were curious about my culture and, you know, things that had to do with me being an Asian, but they were never disrespectful about it, like, you know, that's great. And of course, there were kids who were prejudiced against me because I was Korean, because I mean, nobody cares about the fact that you're Korean. It's just the fact that you're Asian. Like, for kids, they don't really know the difference, you know? And so for them, it's like, oh, those kinds of kids I wasn't friends with, you know? We weren't talking to each other, and it was fine with me. I didn't have to be friends with everyone or get approval from everybody in order, you know, to feel fine about myself. Like, I just think that's kind of ridiculous to try to do that, like, no matter who you are. But to clarify, most of my friends, I would say 99% of my friends were not Korean or Asian. I would say I had like 3 or 4 best friends Two of them were Russian. One of them was a Russian Jew, and another one was a Russian Ukrainian or just Ukrainian. I'm kind of not sure. But anyway, none of them were Asian. Of course, that kind of naturally leads to the question, well, did I feel like I was a Russian or a Korean or what? And I mean, starting with my social circle, which was 90% non-Korean and maybe 10% Korean, and that would include my relatives. Because when we moved to Moscow, we really didn't have anyone in Moscow. We were like the first kind of family there from all the relatives that, and I have lots of relatives, but they mostly lived in Sakhalin, and that's like I don't know, 9-10 hour difference in between. So they were far away, and so if we did socialize with our relatives, it's when they came over or we went over there. It wasn't like a regular thing. Later, some of my relatives moved to Moscow, and we would spend time together a little more often. But I would put relatives in a different category from, the social circle of friends and the people that surround me every day outside of home. And so A, my social circle was almost completely Russian. B, at home, my family didn't speak Korean. Once again, my parents were born in Russia, so they grew up with Russian people just like me. And, Russian became their first language, and their parents talked to them a little bit maybe in Korean, but once you become an adult and you start living your own life and you're around Russian people, you kind of don't really have any reason or opportunity to use Korean. And so when you don't use a language, it goes away. And so yeah, my parents and I, we all communicated in Russian. The only exception was my grandmother. So she spoke really fluent Russian, but she also spoke fluent Korean and Japanese. And so she taught me how to read in Korean and some of Korean phrases. And yeah, whatever I basically knew about Korea and Korean was from my grandmother, a lot of it. My education was at a public school. I mean, public schools are different in Russia, but I was kind of in a hybrid between a public and a private school. It's called a gymnasium. So they have like a public school, a gymnasium, and a lyceum, and like different levels, I guess, of kind of advancement and difficulty and whatever. But anyway, long story short, fully Russian, except I actually went to a Russian-Korean school when I just graduated kindergarten and went to the very, very first grade. And yeah, that was in a Russian-Korean school, but I didn't stay there very long. I was there for maybe like half a year, then we quit because it was just too far from where we lived. And my parents were looking to put me in a school that would be closer to home, but also would, I guess, by educational standards, would challenge me. At that time, the Russian-Korean school was fairly new. It was founded by Korean missionaries to Russia. And so, yeah, there were lots of Korean kids there, but I didn't spend a lot of time there. So, social circle, Russian. At home, we speak Russian. My education was Russian. So, my overall mindset, if I were to try to define it, I would say that my overall mindset was and still is Russian. And I can say this because as some of you know from, watching my content and even maybe just watching this video, you can tell that I am pretty fluent in English. That's because I spent quite some time, about 12 years, living in the States. And there, like when you live abroad for a while, you become aware of your thinking patterns and your kind of logic and reasoning and how you perceive things and how you behave. And you realize that the way you think is different from the way other people think based on where you're from, how you were raised, and the culture that was surrounding you. And so I can quite confidently say that my overall mindset is Russian. Like it's the closest to the Russian mindset, at least. Maybe it's not fully Russian, but in terms of what it's the closest to, I would say Russian. And the funny thing is that I've heard people tell me, like they listen to my story and then they go, that's so sad. Russia erased your identity. And I'm like, what? First of all, who are you to tell me what my identity is? Like, you barely know me. You just heard like about my childhood. And secondly, like, identity is not about your race or the color of your skin or anything like that. Like, okay, I will not try to get political here, but I do believe that an individual should be judged by their individual merits. Because, like, if that's my story, a Korean born and raised in Russia with Russian people, with a Russian mindset, like, that's me. That's who I am. And that doesn't mean that supposedly I had this identity that was erased. Anyway, not gonna get into that too much. Moving on. Even though I was, like I said, in that kind of environment with Russian people, I always knew. And I mean, you don't have to be a genius in that situation to know that you're different. So I always knew I was different, you know? Just, you know, by how I look, like, I am different. And that's okay. Like, I was totally fine with it. Actually, like I said before, I think it was actually better for me because it made me feel like I was unique, as trivial as it sounds. And one thing I think that's kind of important to understand is that Koreans anywhere in the world are still Koreans. It's like you can remove a Korean from Korea, but you cannot remove Korea from a Korean. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that despite living in a predominantly Russian environment, I had a very distinct understanding of also me being a Korean. So it includes even little things like what kind of food we're eating. Our dinner table, lunch, whatever, our home meals, they were always mixed. Like, you would have some Russian food here and there, but a lot of it was just plain old Korean food. And it was actual Korean food, not like some fusion whatever, but like actual Korean food. That's what we ate. Also, Korean culture, you know, the hierarchy, kind of, I guess you can call it that way, still existed, interestingly, in my family. Like, despite the fact that my parents spoke Russian, they grew up in Russia, like, there's still some Korean cultural roots that you just don't remove them. Like, they're there to stay, and they're still there. So, you know, respect for your elders. Never, and I mean never, talk in a way to your grandma or grandpa like they're your buddy. Like, you never do that. Like, Russian people, they do that. And actually, like, it was kind of funny. One day, I remember I was with my friend in music school, and I was maybe like in 4th or 3rd grade. And so your parent or your guardian has to come pick you up from the school. And so my grandmother sometimes would come over there and she would wait for me to finish with my music classes. And then she would pick me up and we would go home. And so I came out of a class with my friend and we go down to the, you know, the lobby, and there's my grandmother there and her grandmother there, and she talks to her grandma and she talks to her, you know, in a very familiar way. Russian language has like 2 pronouns for you, the вы and the ты, which is like, ты is for your friends or familiars or someone who's kind of below you, not in a bad way, but like maybe someone who's younger, like you would address them with ты. But вы is for people who are like higher than you, who you respect, people like teachers, people who are older than you, or people whom you just don't know, you know, they're not your friend, so you're not gonna address them with ты, you're gonna address them with вы. And she talks to her grandma using ты, you know, like, бабушка, ты принесла там мою сумочку, что-то. В общем, anyway, she's like talking to her like that. And then here I am with my grandmother, and I would never think of addressing my grandma with ты. Like, she was always вы. Even though I was very friendly with my grandma, we were very close, and, you know, we would joke with each other all the time, and, you know, I loved her very much, but always with вы. Always that respect has to be there. And so I addressed my grandmother. I was like, здравствуйте, вы долго меня ждали, бабушка? And my friend just like looked at me and then like didn't say anything. And then we went to change our shoes. And like, you have to change your shoes. Anyway, beside the point, we were changing our shoes and she was like, why are you talking to your grandma with вы? Oh, I talk to my grandma with ты because, you know, I love her and she's my friend. I was like, oh, well, I love her and she's my friend too. Like my grandmother, same thing. But like, I just, it's like more respectful. And she was like, oh, I didn't realize. And to her, it was like such a wild thing, I guess. But, and, you know, for me, like, I kind of realized there that like, oh, I guess we're a little bit different here culturally. So long story short, you know, the Korean culture of honoring your elders and ancestors was always there. We also celebrated all of those Korean, you know, holidays, visited, like, you know, graves of our grandparents in a very Korean fashion. So, yeah. Like, I was not unfamiliar with Korean culture. It was always there. We were also part of a church that was founded by Korean missionaries. And so, you know, on Sundays, I would interact with a lot of Koreans. They would speak Korean. So, you know, it was kind of like in and out. So even though the majority of my life was among and with Russian people, Korean aspect of it was always there. And so, you know, now I'm living in Korea. It's not totally foreign to me. Yes, learning Korean is a big curve for me, but at the same time, I don't feel like I'm a total stranger, like a total foreigner here. So am I Russian? Am I Korean? My answer is yes. And now we come to the juicy topic, because this is, let's face it, and I mean, I understand it, that this is probably what most of you guys came here for. If you're not already subscribed to this channel, this is probably what interests you the most. So are Russians like racist? Okay, I'm not trying to make fun of this, but having lived in the US for a while, that was a question that came up a lot. And I think my view of it has changed over time. But I can just tell you kind of my experience and what it was like, and then you can make your own conclusions. I'm not going to tell you. I'm not going to tell you what to think. I know you can think for yourself, and you can make your own conclusions based on what, you know, your life experiences, and, you know, hopefully my story is going to just make it clearer for you. But something to consider, again, like I said earlier, Russia is big. Russia is very wide. So depending on where you are in Russia, you're going to experience different treatment if you are a foreigner. There are some parts of the country that have seen very little traffic of foreigners, and so for them, any foreigner will be like this, ooh, it's like this foreigner, you know. But there are other parts of the country which have seen a lot of foreigners, different kinds, come and go, and so people are used to it. It's not like this, you know, wild thing to see a foreigner. People just might not care at all, you know? My experience, you know, talking about like the 90s and then the early 2000s, before 2010, basically. So I know that Russia has changed a lot also since then. And even, you know, I visited there like last year and it already felt kind of different from what it used to be. So, you know, just saying, take it with a grain of salt. I'm talking about my experience from the past, not necessarily the current situation. But of course, racism existed. Like, it was always there. When I was growing up, I experienced many instances of racism, direct and indirect, minor and major. I will not deny it. Like, I did say that I had a pretty good childhood, but it doesn't mean that there weren't any instances of racism that were there. That kind of sometimes made it feel like kind of meh, you know? So to give you some examples, I guess, instead of talking in abstracts, I might as well give some concrete, you know, examples of what it was like sometimes. And I mean, there were a lot of those, but I'm just picking the ones that were kind of a little more memorable, I guess, or the ones that I can think of that are worth mentioning. One time, I remember, I think I was in 6th or 7th grade, you know, late elementary, early middle school years. And during recess at my school, we had kind of a lunch break. And so I was eating, and it was repeated. It was repeatedly happening. That's why I'm mentioning it. Like lunchtime, we would all go down to the cafeteria, and then the lunch would be distributed, and then we just eat, and then, you know, you go back to your classroom, whatever. And so when I would be in the lunchroom, in the cafeteria, there would be, you know, not just my grade, but like other grades there as well. And there was this guy, actually a group of guys, but one of them was very vocal about it. This Russian kid with very like curly hair, all I remember about him. He was kind of short too. But anyway, he really enjoyed making fun of me because I was Asian. So he, like, every time I would like put food in my mouth, he would be like, oh, watch the monkey eat. And the reason why is because, like, there was this stereotype that Asians look like monkeys. And it also didn't help that I was born in the year of a monkey. But anyway, he kept doing that, like every day during lunch or like during recess. I would just be standing. Like, I remember at one time I was eating chocolate and he was like, "Ooh, I didn't know monkeys eat chocolate." And he would like say it to his friends and they would all like giggle and like just look at me, but he would make it loud enough for others to hear. And my friends sometimes would just look at them like, should we like punch them or something? I'm like, nah, just like let it go. And one time I kind of lost my patience there, and you can kind of get a sense of how other people felt about it too. Like, I was standing eating with my friends again in the cafeteria, and this guy like freaking starts throwing food at me. Like, starts throwing food at me and like saying things, and like that was when I kind of snapped. I like couldn't take it anymore, so I literally took this cup of compote and I went up to him and I just threw it in his face. So he didn't expect it. Nobody expected it. And when I threw it in his face, like this compote just like covers him. He like stands there. He's like in shock. I was ready to fight. I had like my fist ready. And he was just like staring at me, and everyone else just became quiet, and everyone's just like, and then like a few seconds later, people start like cheering, literally like, whoa! There were some seniors there too, and so the senior just like came up to me and like shook my hand for what I did. And it was like, it kind of made me feel kind of weird, because I was like, wow, people actually don't like how this guy is treating me, but no one was saying anything because they didn't know how to go about it. And when I finally snapped, everyone was actually supporting me about it. So anyway, that's a story. Okay, what's another example? So we had a geography class in like 6th or 7th grade, and I really loved the teacher. She was really nice, and I felt like she was respectful of other cultures, and she taught us a lot about the world. And one time we were talking, like, I don't remember exactly how the conversation started in class, but there was a discussion of like different utensils, of like, how did the fork come about? How did the spoon come about? You know, like those things. And it was a pretty interesting topic. And then I was saying something about like forks and spoons, and this kid, he was literally sitting next to me. Like, I don't even understand how he had the guts to do this, but he literally sat next to me right in front of the teacher, and he goes, "You can't really talk about this. You don't have a say because you are from a culture that was too stupid to come up with a fork. You guys are still eating with 2 sticks," meaning chopsticks. And I was like too shocked to like respond to him, because I was like, how do you even come up with that? But the disappointing thing for me was that my teacher didn't say anything. Like, she kind of just ignored it and moved on. And I felt like I was insulted, and like nobody cared. In a way, it was during a class, and just to say, just to give some context, in Russia, you don't really interrupt the teacher. And, class is a class, and what's going on in the class is not necessarily what's happening, outside of it, but it happened. And it was not very pleasant. So those were some 2 instances of kind of like minor examples of racism that I experienced as a kid. And I mean, besides the everyday taunts and whatnot, like, I'm not gonna go into detail with those, but I did hear those pretty much on a regular basis, to a point where I kind of ignored them and didn't care. But there were also some major instances of racism that happened not necessarily directly to me, but that were very close to me, and they were kind of scary. I realized that Timo wasn't really in the frame. But yeah, one time there was actually a threat of a raid. It kind of leaked out. There was apparently some sort of group on the internet that was like a group of, I guess they're kind of like neo-Nazis, and they wanted to come to the island and just slaughter as many like Korean and like basically foreign looking people on the island as they could, because this is a Russian island and they have nothing to do here. And I mean, it was like it was a thing that was there, and it got to the authorities, and everybody on the island was getting ready for a massacre, and everyone was starting to like arm up with pitchforks and knives and all that. They were like Like everybody, not just Asian people, but Russian people, everybody on the island. They were like, we will not let this happen. We will defend our people no matter who they are. You know, it never happened. But there was a commotion about that. I remember that. Another thing that was fairly regular every year, again, it's this neo-Nazi thing. I don't quite understand where it's coming from, but it's there. It was there in Russia. I'm not sure if it still is, but whenever it was Hitler's birthday, I would just stay home. I believe Hitler's birthday is sometime in April, so school is still in, and yeah, I'd just skip school. I just wouldn't go, because like there were gatherings of people in the subway and in other public places that were kind of sketchy. And it was just like, use your common sense. Like, it's recommended for you not to be out just for your own safety. And, you know, I'm a kid, I commute to my music school, to my elementary school, and like, I'm not gonna risk it. So that's another thing. There were also a few news of Russian Koreans getting stabbed in the subway. So there was one time when this Russian Korean kid, he's not a foreign Korean, he's actually like a Russian Korean like me. He was on the subway kind of late at night going home. And the thing is, like, some people from my church knew him. Like, it's not some stranger. It's a person who actually was connected to the people that I knew. And he was in the subway and then, you know, late at night going home. And there were these people, like 2 or 3 guys that got on the same train. And when they saw him, they beat him up and they stabbed him with a knife, with however many that were there. Everyone had a knife. And they stabbed him so hard that he pretty much almost died, but something happened. He was struggling with them, and luckily, the train arrived at a station and the doors open, right? There's no one else on the train. It's just him and these people beating him up and trying to kill him. He gets out of it somehow. He like escapes them. And it just so happened that there was a police officer at the station. And so when he came out, the police officer, you know, he sees this person bleeding, like pretty much dying. So he comes up to him, and these guys, they try to run away. The police officer tries to chase them. So the guy was put in the hospital and he survived. But like, yeah, that happened. And, you know, that was pretty scary because I also took the subway late at night. When I would go to music school after my regular school hours and then come home sometimes at like 10 or 11 p.m. And so, yeah, I would like be genuinely scared sometimes when there was no one around. So I would just try to get out of there as fast as possible and, you know, always try to be in the crowd, always try to be with people. There was also, I remember one time I watched on TV, they made a documentary about foreigners getting attacked in Russia, especially Moscow. Like, there was a documentary, I remember I was watching it, maybe I was in like 7th grade, and they were talking about this black girl that she may have been half Russian, half black, I'm not sure, but she didn't look Russian, certainly. And yeah, she was walking in her own house, like in her own apartment building to her apartment, and on the way there, there were these people that ambushed her, they raped her, they killed her, and like she was younger than me even at that point, and that was scary to me. Like, I found that out and I was like, oh man, like that actually happened to a child. This is scary. I mean, to adults, I think it's pretty scary, but to me at that time, those kinds of things definitely put things into perspective. Use your common sense, be careful, and understand that there are hateful people out there who want to harm you. And you need to do whatever you need to do for your own safety. That was a lesson I learned very early. Now, did these experiences make me hate Russia or Russians? No. It certainly made it feel sometimes like, you know, there are these predators after us, but it didn't make me hate my friends, my teachers, the people who lived around me, who were, you know, part of my life. Like, no. Another thing also, even though those things were happening around me and with me sometimes, I never felt oppressed or disadvantaged. And here, I think, is where the Korean culture of diligence and hard work really comes in, because education is really important. Not working hard is completely out of the question. Like, slacking off is a vice. So, like, because I studied diligently, I was a good student overall. And there were actually many times when, in fact, I was either appointed or I initiated some sort of position of leadership. We had kind of a speech and debate club at my school, and, you know, I was part of it. In fact, I was one of the leading people in it, and nothing prevented me from, you know, being in a club which is all about rhetoric and being Russian and speaking Russian. Like, nothing and no one prevented me from being part of it. And, you know, I was part of it and I did well. Actually won a prize. Some people were even talking to me about, like, hey, do you want to try going on this, it was either a radio show or a TV show. They were like, your rhetoric is pretty good in Russian. You should try maybe this show, whatever. It never happened because we moved, but I was actually interested in that. I was like, I don't mind being on the radio. I don't mind being on TV. And, you know, when there were plays or, you know, drama, theater at our school, and they needed people to fill certain roles, like, I never felt like, you know, oh, I'm Asian, so I can't play this role. Like, this is supposed to be like a Russian person kind of role. I never even thought that. That was not my experience. So if there was an opportunity, I took it. I never refrained from something just because I was Korean. At least I don't remember anything like that. Now, once again, I am talking about my experience at that time. So I'm not trying to tell you what to think about racism in Russia or anywhere else, or what racism looks like. I'm just telling you what my experience was, what my conclusions are, what I was thinking back then, what I'm thinking about it now, and what I just personally make of it. You can make your own conclusions, but to make my conclusion about this, how was my childhood? Great. Do I like Russia? Yes, I love Russia. Russia is my home. Russia is where, you know, my relatives are. A lot of my friends still are. This is where, you know, I grew up. How do I identify now? Same as before, you know. I'm a person who happens to be Korean and Russian at the same time, and with a bit of American in me now, you know. And you know, I enjoy it. I think it's fun. I think it's cool. And you know, who knows, maybe in the future I'll have some more cultural input in me, you know. That's about it. Well, how about you guys? What kind of experiences have you had? Are you a Russian Korean yourself? Or are you, you know, having the same kind of experience, but, you know, you have a different race living in a different country? And what's it like to you? What are some of your unique stories? Is there anything else you would like me to make a video about related to this? Let me know in the comment section below. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel. This is Zoya, the Russian Korean. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.